Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's PMI Friday webinar, Understanding Performance Through Control Charts with Damion Albinson. Just so that you know, it's actually Damien's birthday today, so happy birthday, Damion, and a big thank you for celebrating your birthday with us. My name's Susanna Clark, and I'll be facilitating the session today, which includes running the Q&A desk. So we'll be using this throughout today's presentation. You can find the Q&A and the chat buttons on your Zoom control panel. So please do keep your questions coming. Any comments you have, any observations, I will also be sharing those with Damion. Today's webinar is being recorded and we'll send you a link via email early next week to the full recording of both the audio and the presentation. As usual, we are also broadcasting live on Facebook and LinkedIn. So to those of you who are joining us on these live streams, welcome today. In future, to be able to participate in polls, receive the recording via email, or to make any suggestions for future topics, please do register for the webinars at pmi.co.uk/webinars. Finally, from me, before we get underway, we do send all registered participants a short Voice of the Customer survey. We're always grateful for your feedback. It's how we learn and how we improve. And also, we're really interested in any suggestions you have for future webinar topics. Now, I'd like to hand over to Damion.
Okay, thanks, Susanna, and thanks for the birthday wishes. Today, I would like to do this webinar on performance through control charts. Okay, so in terms of who I am, Damion Albinson, I'm a senior consultant with PMI, been with the business now over 8 years, and I've spent the best part of the last 20 years working in and around business improvement. What I can say is I first came across this thing called a control chart 20 years ago, and for me, it really resulted in what I would probably say is an epiphany, a real paradigm shift in terms of how I started to look at data differently ever since. So what I'm hoping to do today is take you through some of those kind of moments that I had when I first learned about this tool, and in the hope that actually you get those same kind of insights. So what we're planning to cover is why use control charts at all in your operations. I then want to talk about, what's the control chart actually telling us? How does it work, and what's it trying to inform us about? And then I'm going to move into slightly talking about how and where to measure. So there's some things to think about there. And then lastly, how should we react if we're using control charts? So that's what we're going to cover. So I'd like to start, as I normally do, with a poll, just to find out a little bit more about my audience that we've got on today. So the question is, to what extent does your organization already make use of control charts? And it's to select one answer. So either they're used across the whole organization, they're used in some areas, but not all. Perhaps you only really see them when they're confined to improvement projects, which is a common place for them to be, but they're not ordinarily used in daily operations. They're never used, or lastly, you're not sure because maybe you don't know what a control chart is yet, perhaps. So we'll wait for those results to come in. I can see there's a flurry of activity.
So yes, flurry of activity, which at the moment leading the pack is that these are usually they use them when they use, sorry, I'll put my other set of teeth in a moment, that they use them when they run improvement projects, but not so much in daily operations. Yeah. And we do have some people who've never used them or are not using them. So that's interesting to see. Yeah. Hopefully they'll get a lot out of today. Absolutely. So I'm just going to leave that open for a few more seconds. So if you haven't yet cast your vote, if you'd like to, and then I'll be ending polling and I will share the results with everybody. Okay.
Right, very interesting.
So yes, we have a clear winner. Is that expected? Is that the one you thought people might?
Um, Pretty much, actually, yeah. That's kind of what I expected to see, because of course we do see these in improvement projects, and of course when we teach the likes of Sigma type project approaches, we often talk about the value of using control charts, and that's a point I'm going to come on to. But yeah, it's really fascinating that only 14% are using them across the whole organisation, and collectively then the rest of it makes up the other 86% where they're only used partially or not at all. So that's really yeah, kind of what I might have expected to see, actually. And I'm going to move on later to talk about maybe one of my theories as to perhaps why it's like that, why it's so. So I'll come back to those results later on. Thank you very much.
So I've just had a point come in from one of our participants, Tony, who's saying they are also used, let me get that open, as part of the daily management system quite frequently. So that's interesting.
Right, yeah, it is. Okay, thank
Super,
you, Tony.
thank you.
Thanks, Susanna. Okay, so the first topic, before we get into the control chart itself, I just want to take a moment to talk about variation. And the thing about variation is it's in everything. So every system, every process will exhibit some form of variation. It's a natural thing. It's something that you can't escape. And so no matter what industry you work in, or department, or function, so you could be in sales, education, marketing, customer support, it doesn't matter. All processes will be plagued by variation because it's a natural phenomenon. It's always going to be there. So this is really where control charts come in, because control charts help us to start to understand and make sense of this variation that surrounds all of us all the time. So why use them in your operations? Well, let's take a process view. And you can look at this slide either in the context of a single process within an organization, or you could even consider this a high-level view of the entire organization. So of course there are customers who receive a product or a service, and what we've just said is that there's variation in everything. So of course the process creating these products or services, there will be variation in those products or services. And where is that variation coming from? Well, it's coming from the process, of course, but the inputs to that process are all also going to exhibit variation. So I guess you could say in short that what process improvement is about is looking at the data that we might collect from the process itself and comparing that to what the customer's needs and expectations are if we're listening to them. And the whole wrestle begins of trying to wrestle with this variation that's there, whilst trying to make sure that we satisfy the customer's needs. So because there's this variation everywhere, and it's in all different things, then it makes sense that we ought to start to maybe try and make sense of it and understand it. The other aspect of variation, of course, is the customers, whatever they're receiving, or it could be requirements imposed on the process from the business as well, such as things like speed and accuracy and cost and so on. The hidden requirement that often sits with those requirements is this need for consistency. None of us like inconsistency. It makes it difficult to plan. It makes it difficult to predict things. And even in our personal lives, we like things to be predictable. So your customers, all customers will no doubt have a need for a greater consistency. So again, it reinforces this need to say, we really do need to get a handle on this and at least begin to understand what might our inconsistency look like. And there's some barriers that can get in the way of that, which I'm going to move on to. So those that have been on these webinars before have no doubt seen this model before. It's Deming's system of profound knowledge. And Deming had variation as a component of this model because of the importance of it for the points I've made. So, and his quote said, there's always going to be variation between people in output, in service, in product. But what is that variation trying to tell us? And that's a really interesting and fascinating way for us to be thinking about variation. It's potentially there to learn from. And then we're going to look at the reasons why sometimes we may not get as much learning from variation, depending on what we're measuring and how we do those measures and so on. So what is a control chart and how do they work? So I'm going to try and make sure that this isn't overly technical. So a control chart itself is made up of 3 components. There's always a space, or there ought to really be a space, for the measurements themselves, actually writing those down. So that's usually at the top. The middle part of a control chart is called the individuals chart. And it has that name because each one of those points of data that's being plotted is an individual measurement of something that's taken from above. And so that's just a normal time series run chart, essentially. And then beneath that, we have this other graphic, which is also part of the control chart. And this is called a moving range chart. What this is doing is it's plotting the differences between those measurements in the middle, how much of a movement has occurred between those measurements. And so you use all 3 of those components together to actually use a control chart. So the sort of mechanics that sit behind a control chart sort of work like this. So here we've got just a normal run chart of some data. This particular one is number of defects in a process across the working days. And if we use some mathematics, we're able to calculate some probabilities about where the variation in the data may fall with respects to the average, which is that horizontal line we've drawn through the middle, which is probably estimated by eye about 9.5, something like that. So if we come out by plus or minus 1 of something called a standard deviation, it suggests that we should expect something like 60 to 75% of those measurements to fall within that blue range in the middle there. If we come out further by an additional plus or minus 2 of these standard deviations, now we can expect to see 90 to 98% of those measurements falling in that kind of range. By the time we get out to plus or minus 3, the laws of probability dictate that 99 to 100% of the data points will fall within that range. And this is why on the control chart, we end up with these, what are called limits, upper and lower control limits. And they are basically estimating where we might expect the variation to fall with respects to the average. I'm going to talk on later about why that can be useful. In fact, it's actually on this slide. So if we were to learn about a process we hadn't measured before, we might start to take individual measurements of something, and we can begin to plot those measurements over time. And given what we've said already about variation, we know that, or we ought to expect at least, that these results are going to vary. They're going to bounce up and down. Most of them are going to be close to the average, and as we get further away from the average, we can expect maybe less and less to occur. And so we can calculate these control limits using relatively very simple mathematical terms. You do not need to be a statistician to be able to use a control chart. And we get these limits, and under certain conditions, so if this process has been standardized and we're not changing anything on purpose, we're just routinely doing the same thing over and over again, and we're getting this natural variation. Under certain conditions, we're able to predict that even in the future, so long as we don't change anything, there's a 99.74% certainty that the measurement points are going to stay within those lines. Now, there's no other tool I'm aware of that can predict the future with such a high level of certainty. So if you think about that a little bit, that already makes the control chart actually a very, very useful tool to have in your toolkit. So what is the control chart telling us? Well, the control charts this year are 100 years old. The guy that actually invented them was called Walter Shewhart in the 1920s. And he said, all data sets are going to contain noise, but some data sets may also contain what you refer to as signals. And so before you can detect these signals, which might be something of interest to us, we have to have a way of filtering out the noise so we can kind of see the wood for the trees. And that's essentially what control charts do. They enable us to filter through two types of variation, and I will talk about what they are later on. In fact, actually on this next slide, sorry. So if I were to take a pen, and you can even try this at home, if you have a pen and piece of paper, if you were to just write your name or do your signature or something 3 times in a row. So this is one that I did the other month. And you can see that that's now, obviously, I've written my name many times. So you could say it's a safe assumption that that's a pretty well practiced process. And yet, despite how well practiced I am at that, those names are not identical. They're not completely dissimilar, but they're not identical. And this type of variation has a name. It's called common cause. And the thing about common cause is it's that type of variation that will always be there, guaranteed. Whichever process you ever measure, you're guaranteed to see at least common cause variation. And it's common cause variation isn't due to any particular thing. It's actually due to a whole myriad of factors that are all changing at the same time. So if I try to, if we try to understand, well, why is my name not the same? What makes it different each time? And we could start to think about, the flow of the ink through the pen, the position of my hand on the page, the speed at which I'm writing, my concentration levels. All of these factors are all interplaying and changing at the same time. And the consequence of that is that there's a slight difference in the outcome of that process of writing my name. So it's impossible with common cause variation to say that it's only there because of this one thing that changed or this other thing that changed. It's always going to be a combination of factors. Now, if I were to make a dramatic change to this process, and I wrote my name one more time, but I put the pen into my left hand, which is my non-dominant writing hand, and now the difference is quite considerable. Okay, we're not talking about a slight inconsistency with the others. It's now noticeably, obviously different. And this type of variation also has a name. It's called assignable cause. And this is due to a specific change in the process, which has had such a dominant effect on the output that it appears very different from the natural expected common cause variation that we should expect to see there. And so these are the two types of variation that control charts help us to differentiate between, and that actually can be ridiculously useful for a number of reasons, which I'm hoping to come on to. So how should we measure? How should we measure a process? Well, I'd like to do another poll shortly, but I just want to set this one up. So let's just take this scenario. We have a fairly typical KPI. In fact, it's one that I've seen in many organizations now over the years. We have a bar chart, a very common way of displaying data. This particular measure is of a complaint resolution process, and it's of a certain type of complaint. So they've obviously filtered them. And the axis is how many days it takes them to resolve a complaint. And across the bottom, we have the different case numbers as and when they were completed. And they've highlighted there that there's a red line at 20 days, which indicates that that is the maximum time that they are allowed to spend resolving these cases. Let's assume that's a customer requirement. Okay, must not take more than 20 working days. And they've made it really clear with the bar chart where they've failed that requirement by drawing the bar as a red bar. So the poll question that I'd like to put to you is, how might most managers be tempted to respond to this metric if they were in charge of it? So answer one is they would seek corrective actions for each of these abnormalities as they've shown them in red. Number two is they would seek answers from those responsible. So if they're in charge of that team, they might go out to the individuals and try and find out who did it and speak to them and find out a little bit more. Answer three, they wouldn't respond to the abnormalities. And answer 4 is maybe they would try and drum up more team motivation. You know, come on, try harder. This is not good enough. So it looks like the poll is now running.
So that poll's been launched. We had a clear leader, seek answers from those responsible. That was the first area that people thought would be where most other managers would start. And then obviously we've got some people who are thinking about seeking out corrective actions for each of the abnormalities that they come across.
Yeah. Very good. I can see the
So
results.
just going to take a little bit longer, and if you have any comments, please do add them into the chat or add them into the Q&A. Any observations? Okay, so I'm going to give it another few seconds, then I will close this poll and share the results.
Okay, right. Okay, so clear winner there. Well, not clear already. It's quite close, isn't it? 45% would seek corrective actions for the abnormality. That does not surprise me at all that that's come out on top. Because you know, and in fact, if you look back at our catalogue, I did a webinar some time ago talking about, you know, learning to see, and part of that being about the need to recognise when something's abnormal versus not abnormal, and therefore that's where you should problem solve. And so this is a very classic way of displaying data, and that doesn't surprise me that response has come out on top.
Yes, and I can almost imagine, you know, a manager feeling that they would be, you know, not doing their job properly if they saw that something was outside of an SLA. Well, they should follow it up. Yeah.
Now, interestingly, the maybe not so intuitive answer of I would not respond to the abnormalities, number 3, 7%. I suspect that those 7% may know something about control charts already.
You think so?
So I'll come on to that. And seek answers from those responsible, which is really, really fascinating answer as well, 41%. And motivate the team, 7. So, okay, excellent. I'm really, really interested in those. I'm hoping actually, because the majority of people there, 86%, I'm hoping that on this next slide, I'm going to change your mind. That's my hope, right? I can't promise. I'll have a go. So let's just have a look on this next slide so here's the measure we had. This time we've added the average performance there as well, just to make that clear. Here's that same data in a control chart. Now, I haven't talked about how to interpret control charts yet, and I do intend to. But what I can tell you is that control chart is telling us that the variation in that process is normal. It's common cause variation. In other words, it's just that natural variation that was always going to be there. So there is really nothing special about any of those data points. So the very low green ones are no more special than these very high red ones. So this really is one of those moments that struck me when I first saw control charts. It just completely began to change the way in which I looked at data. And of course, now if we reflect on had we gone and taken the time to try and investigate those reds and to launch investigations and use problem solving tools and all those great things, it could have all been for nothing. It could have just been we were chasing after something that isn't really there. And maybe even worse than that, if we'd have gone after those responsible, and depending on the outcome of what we did with those people, in some cases, in the most extreme cases, those people might end up on disciplinary action. And in fact, in very, very extreme cases, those people might even lose their job. And yet, if we'd have looked at the data in a different way, i.e. if we'd have used the control chart, we wouldn't have done anything, because we'd have recognized that actually that variation is just normal, it's natural. So this is really emphasizes, I think, the power of using control charts to understand data, and more importantly than that, they enable us to make much better decisions. I'm going to probably emphasize that point several times as we go through today's webinar. Of course, that example of the bar chart with the target drawn on there and the reds and greens and so on is not the only way that we actually often manipulate and show data in a way that can be very misleading. So here's another very common way that organizations often display data. It's not just organizations, actually. This happens in the media, it happens in the news, it happens on TV and documentaries. We are surrounded by what I would now consider, knowing more about control charts, very unuseful ways of showing data. So if you look at this example, it's a credit organization, and this month compared to the same month last year suggests that there's been a decrease in how many small loans they provided. And no doubt that someone then might be expected to explain why that's happened, again, if they were responsible for it. The question is, we are making a comparison there between two pieces of data. And the question would be, knowing about control charts, what were all the other months like? And actually, was this just maybe there's nothing unique at all about the 9,356. It could just be a slightly low number, and the 1,200 number could be a slightly high one. But maybe they all belong to just a set of common cause variation, which is naturally going to bounce up and down across those months. And yet, despite that, this is a really common way that people tend to look at data and display it and try and make decisions. Okay, Suze, it looks like we have a question.
So I've got one question and one observation, but I thought the observation would be useful to share with everyone. So Clee, great to have you with us. Clee says that was a great slide, Damion, the previous one with the bar charts, and he was saying he wish he could share that. So just to confirm, we will be sending you a full recording, so you will get that picture, you will be able to share it. And then we have another question that came in that was, so are you really saying that the bar chart masks the trends that are there in the data?
Okay, I've got to be careful that I don't turn this into too much of a technical discussion on this webinar, but the word trend always now, ever since I saw control charts 20 years ago, the word trends actually sends a little shiver down my spine. It always makes me kind of go, oh, because trends, I think looking at trends in data is another very common practice that's often very, very misleading about what's really going on. I think let's come back to that later on when I've talked a little bit more about the control charts, because I think you'll recognize that that yes, in fact, no, the short answer is yes, the bar chart and the way it was being displayed there is very misleading. It gives us a different conclusion about the performance than what really is happening. Yeah. So trends as well is another dangerous territory, let's say.
Thanks.
But I will give you a solution to that at the end as well. So
great, thank you.
And then here's another common way that data is often displayed or used in a way that can mislead us. So we often maybe compare average performance to this target or requirement from the customer. So this example, there's a requirement for the performance to be no more than 14 days. And on average, their performance is 9 days. So in summary, that sounds great. If you were their senior leadership team and they gave you that as a summary of performance, you'd think, oh, wonderful. Yeah, they're doing very well. Or maybe they turn it into percentages and they say 95% of our performance is within the service level agreement or the target from the customer. And again, this 95% seems to have been held up as a bit of an industry standard where that's what we go after as, good performance. That would be considered ideal. But if I showed you using a histogram, all of the variation in this process, you can see that we do have some instances of the performance going beyond 14 days. And the question, of course, would be how satisfied were those customers, despite us believing that average performance is great or 95% adherence to that target is great. Those customers had an awful experience. Okay, it looks like I have another question.
Oh yeah, we've got them going now. It's great. So this question, thank you very much, DJ. The question is, the finance team always use bar charts and line charts and the month-on-month comparisons. They're very, very common things in companies. So the question is, Damion, do you know any company who show financial data in control charts?
I do. In fact, even better than that, I work for one. So in PMI, we absolutely do practice what we preach, and we, if you ever have the chance to visit our office in Coventry, then we'd be more than happy to spend a little bit of time showing you how our visual management set up there, where all of the processes that we have in the organisation all have at least one control chart on the key metrics, because we have recognised just how useful that is to help us make better decisions. So yes, and I've worked, of course, with many of our clients, where of course we recommend that this is the way they go with when it comes to measures. So yes, I've seen plenty of organisations that have made that leap to let's start using control charts. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. I would like to, we're not in the silo of one. So yes, we do regularly work with finance teams, and it completely changes their perspective on what they are reporting and how they report it.
Yeah. Back to that slide, back to that Deming quote. There's always going to be variation in everything. What is it trying to tell us? So some of those practices that I've showed you, which are very common ways of organizations in the way that they display data, makes it not useful to understand what variation is trying to tell us. In fact, some of those techniques don't even approach variation altogether. When we quote average performance, we throw away all of the information about variation. We lose it all. And that's not what Deming was recommending to do. He said, what's it trying to tell us? And this is, I think, my theory on why we got those results in the first poll, where only 12% of people said that control charts are used through the whole organisation, and only 26% said that it was some use of them, which left all the other percentages. Let me quickly do that in my head. About 62% of people not using them or only using them in isolated situations. And my theory on that is, it's so easy for us to display data using other means other than control charts in this day and age, and it has been for many years. Computers make it really easy to do quick analysis and create bar charts and all these other kinds of, and we're surrounded by those methods of displaying data outside of work as well. So the temptation for us to use these alternate ways is there, and I think it's always going to be there. And it's why the control chart that's 100 years old still isn't widely adopted by many organizations. And I think that's such a shame. I just think there's so many people missing out on what they could offer them. Okay, so what to measure is another golden question, because we could start using control charts tomorrow. Maybe some of you now might want to do that, but you could start control charting everything, and maybe that wouldn't be so useful either. Meaningful to the customer. So let's look at this. So we go back to the same case study. Let's just think about it for a minute. They're measuring case resolution time. So they could put that in a control chart like I did, and that would be useful to them, would stop them responding to these false alarms. But hang on a minute. Let's just think, what would the customer really want? Well, yes, they would value the complaints being resolved, I would assume, as quick as possible. Would they not prefer, though, to not have to complain at all in the first place? So sometimes if we don't necessarily put a little bit of forethought into what are we measuring, we might actually end up being satisfied of a particular measure improving, even though, at a higher level, we could do much better. And I see this a lot in people's projects when we help them do projects improvement. People are often focused on metrics like this without considering, shouldn't we be looking at trying to get rid of complaints full stop? And let's try and drive that metric down. So the point here is, when you're thinking about measures or selecting them, or even assessing the ones you already have, one of the forethoughts should be, how useful are these measures in telling us something about what our customers experience, even if they're internal customers. So we have this guide in terms of how to approach this. Determine the true quality characteristic of what is of value to your customer, whether that be internal, external, or both. Then once you've done that, you can start to think about the method in which we would measure that, so, frequencies and quantities and so on. And then you can go back around with the customer and agree measurable requirements. Now, of course, overlaying that approach is that there will be things that the business would like you to measure as well, other stakeholders, and that's fine. But I think so long as you focused on the customer primarily first, and then those secondary people afterwards. And for those that have been on webinars before, have probably seen us talking about these metrics before. So we have 3 different types or categories of measures. We have measures of effectiveness, we have measures of efficiency, and sometimes measures of adaptability. And what we're looking for in organizations is to have a balance. If you have a very effective process, and measures of effectiveness are looking at how well the process meets those customer requirements, which is often focused on the external, that's great. But if you have a super effective process or business that isn't very efficient, well, then that's not going to be very good for longevity of the business. However, what many organizations do is they are very focused on efficiency, maybe overly focused on efficiency, to the detriment of effectiveness. And again, there's a very short-term, foresight for that. If you're extremely efficient at something that isn't effective for your customers, then again, your customers are maybe going to start to go to someone else. And then we have adaptability measures, which are measures of how flexible, how adaptable are we to changes, usually changes from customer requirements. And I've become particularly interested in this type of measure recently, because I think adaptability can actually be the destroyer of effective and efficiency measures or performance. If we get sudden changes and we're very rigid, that could actually take a process that was effective and efficient and suddenly make it the opposite. So we recommend, if you're considering starting to measure or looking at the measures you already have, think about, do we have a good balance across these 3 types? And then the final thing I think I'll say on what to measure is going back to the process view. So if we take this process flowchart horizontally displayed, steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, lots of measures tend to be what we call a results measure. And a results measure, as you can see on the diagram, is the measurement that's taken after the process is finished. All those steps are finished doing whatever they do, and we're summarizing performance. And so results measures tend to be quite slow. They might be things that the management team review the end of each week, or maybe even monthly. And so they're useful. They give us a sense of where we are in relation to targets or whatever else, but they're not that useful for improvement, because there's a lag. They might, if you suddenly see something that happened end of last week, it's very difficult to go back and understand what that was. Before I go on, I'm going to stop, because it looks like we have another question.
A couple of questions. So one in from John. He says, do you think that control charts are not as popular because they're just not widely known, particularly on how to interpret them, compared to something like a line chart or a Pareto diagram, which are? And he makes the comment that he'd never heard of control charts until we introduced him to them.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably a number of reasons why they're not as widely used as some of us would like or hope for. And yeah, I think that's probably a valid theory. I think that there is a degree of learning that has to come with control charts, and you do really want to be under some, I think, competent tutelage, I think is how Don Wheeler once put it, one of the famous statisticians. And yeah, so there is a bit of learning to go with it, and maybe that might frighten certain people away. But unlike a normal run chart, which you could probably taught how to do those in school or something, you just carry on using them, don't you? So yeah, that could be a valid theory. That could be a very valid theory.
And a question from Tony, who asks, what's the difference between process capability and process adaptability?
Okay, right. That's a very interesting question, actually. I'm trying to think about what we might mean by that. So process capability is something I'm going to kind of lightly touch on later on. It's not something I wanted to go into in depth on this particular webinar, but I will reference it later on. How's that different from process adaptability? I suppose it's back to the process capability really is a way of describing, especially if you've used control charts and understood variation, you know, how likely is it that our process can perform without breaching those targets or you know, whatever the customer set. And you can even do calculations for that called capability analysis. Whereas process adaptability, I suppose, it would be, can we adapt to changes in customer requirements without it causing a detrimental effect on process capability? I don't know if that really answers that question. I think we'd need to maybe sit down and talk about that in a bit more depth, to be honest. But
Yes.
that's probably the best I can do, actually.
Thanks, Damion, and thanks everyone for your questions.
Okay. So yeah, so results measures, they tend to summarize. Okay, so they're useful as a guide, but they're not so useful necessarily for improvement. Process measures, on the other hand, are measures of activities or aspects of the work as it happens in the process itself. And they're usually, or ought to be, as live as possible. So you're plotting data or even getting it displayed live in the moment. And that therefore, you can detect abnormalities much quicker in terms of signals, which I'm going to talk about, and therefore respond faster and make quicker decision making. So in terms of my advice of where to measure, I'd say probably look hard at your process measures, because they're going to be, the idea of getting control of a process measure is it influences what you might then see in the results measure, which could be several days later. So some examples of how control charts can be applied in different industries, and because some people think that they're only, you know, you can only use them in technical type departments, or you can only use them in manufacturing and things like that, and that's not true. So sales, for instance, I've seen some fantastic application of control charts in sales where they looked at things like, you know, the quantity of sales per some time frame, maybe per week or per month. The number of leads that they've generated, which might then give them some intelligence about the impact of a new marketing campaign that they've tried out. Finance, you know, invoice to payment duration. So is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Is it pretty much staying the same? Construction companies could use them for the time to complete the stages of build, or the number of errors per plot or per site. And again, that might tell them something about how effective are some new practices that they brought in, or some new policies about how they operate. We've done lots of work with charities over the years, looking at things like the donation value, which might be, again, the success of their campaigns to get more people to donate. So you can get some really, really fascinating insights out of using control charts, because they ultimately tell you whether you've made a difference or you haven't. We'll touch on that point towards the end. So here's some real examples of control charts being used. This first one is new social media followers by week. So you can see there that they've got plenty of variation, but they've also had these spikes, which have gone red. They're what we refer to as signals, and it's to those where they've invested the time and energy to go and investigate and find out what caused those. And you can see there that they've even annotated them to record what they discovered. Whereas this one is a finance process looking at the value of debt over 30 days. And on this one, we don't have any of these, what we call signals, which means that this process is, I would argue, probably easier to manage. Okay, they simply plot the data point each day or each week, and because they're not seeing these signals, it's okay, there's nothing more to say. We don't have to describe or spend another hour saying why the value is slightly higher or lower than the previous one. That would just be foolish. And so think of the time and energy that you could save if you started to use control charts to manage your daily operations. So there's a selling point. So when to react? Well, there's two things we look for on a control chart, as you saw on those previous examples. The first one, and these are called signals. So if a data point goes beyond one of those control limits, that would be considered extremely unlikely to happen purely by chance. There's a much, much greater probability that something in the process changed and it caused that particular performance to occur that far from the average. So this saves you a lot of time and energy. You don't go chasing after all these other data points. You only respond when you get one of these signals, and you're very likely to find something that caused it, which is going to teach you something about your process that maybe you didn't know before. The other type of signal we can get is where we get 8 consecutive points on the same side of the average. And again, the probabilities of that happening purely by chance are much less than 1%. It's the same probability as tossing a coin, heads or tails, 8 times in a row, getting the same result 8 times in a row. If you get really bored later, give that a go tonight and you'll see how many times. I think it comes out as something like 10,000 tosses, and you might actually see that happen once. So again, it's far more likely that something in the process changed which caused this signal to appear. So we end up with 2 conditions. We either end up with a process we say is unstable, and that means that it has common cause variation, and it also has these signals that tell us that something unexpected is happening. So when a process is out of control, it means it's unpredictable. We don't know what it's going to do next. That means it has these assignable cause signals present. You can see there's a couple of points on this one outside the limits. And therefore, the need here would be, before we do anything else, we need to get it back in control before we attempted to try and do anything more fancy, like improve its performance or move the average or something, because those efforts might get lost in the chaos of the data moving around. So it's this kind of situation where you might see this sort of thing in sort of more daily operations. And when we see these signals, they tell us when we need to react. And I've already made the point about how much time that could save in not having to respond to these other points that actually weren't really a signal. And so these signals prompt when we should then start using the problem solving tools, and the investigation approaches, things we've talked about in other webinars. And again, that responding in the moment to those is only going to teach us more about our own process. So it reinforces this need to, let's use measures to learn rather than using measures for other purposes like punishing and rewarding people and those kind of things. However, you might be in this situation where the process is stable and predictable. And here's our control chart from earlier again, the complaint resolution time. It is indeed in control, it's stable and predictable. I'll caveat that by saying half the control chart is actually missing because I don't have the range chart, but with the bit we can see, it appears to be stable and predictable. Now, if you remember, the SLA, the maximum that they were allowed to spend, was sat there at 20. I've drawn a line on there to represent that. And that's why we saw those 3 red bars on the bar chart, because those 3 data points just happened to fall above that line. But this is saying, well, if we carry on doing what we've always done in the complaint resolution process, let me just back up a little bit, then that's what we're always going to get. The control chart's telling us that. It says you're going to get an average of about 16 days, and it could be as many as 20, 26, 27 days at the upper line, and it could be as fast as only 5 days. And none of those performances should surprise us, okay? Because it's just, that's what it's going to do. But because the customer would like it to be no more than 20, it suggests that from time to time, it will appear that we've failed. And so to fix this situation, we have 2 choices. One of them is we need to figure out how we would move the average. The other solution is we need to reduce the common cause variation. And the way that we do that is we have to go through a process of understanding all of the different potential causes of that variation, and then very methodically working our way through and doing lots of experiments to find out which ones really do have an effect. And that type of approach is often what we teach in some of the project approaches that we offer our clients. You might, though, be in a situation where it's stable and predictable and it's well within what the customer wants. So then what do? Well, there is a saying down here at the bottom, on target with minimum variation. It was a quote from a guy called Taguchi. And the logic here is that even if our variation is within what the customer is willing to tolerate, we should still continue to look for opportunities to reduce variation. Because going right back to one of the first slides, customers value consistency. And there's actually a benefit to the customer and the organization if we continuously follow in the pursuit of trying to minimize variation all the time. Just the same as in lean, we would say the pursuit is of perfection, zero waste, something you will probably never get to, but that's what we should set our sights on as more like a strategic direction. Now, I've seen the list of people that opted for today's webinar, and I noticed that a few people worked in sort of continuous improvement roles and that kind of thing. So here's another value, I think, for where control charts can support you if you're responsible for business improvement. And again, many of you have probably seen this model before, the 3-question model. What are we trying to accomplish? How will we know a change is an improvement? And then we go into the whole PDSA cycle of doing experiments and using data. This, for me, is another really valuable place where control charts support, because if you've tested a solution, let's say, and you're plotting the data in the hope that the control chart will now show a signal because you've generated that signal, you've forced that signal to appear because you've made some change, but you don't see that signal, that is evidence that says that change did not make an improvement. So control charts give you a very robust, crystal clear, black and white view that you either made a change or you didn't. And any other way of crunching the numbers to summarize what might have happened as a consequence of change is likely to maybe tell you that there was an improvement when actually there wasn't. Control charts won't let you down. They will tell you you've either influenced the process or you haven't, because if you have influenced it, you would have generated a signal. So if you're in the improvement world, like I was for many years, control charts are just an absolute must for answering that question. It looks like on that note, we have another question.
I'm really conscious of time, but we have a question which is sort of with your point about control charts won't let you down. I just thought this was a good time, because one of the questions we've been asked is, is there a risk that the common cause variation that you're looking at is in effect hiding the inefficiency?
Hiding the inefficiency. I'm not too sure it would. I don't think. I think that could come down to what.
I guess isn't it about how wide your limits are? Because potentially to the example you used earlier, I was thinking that effectively had some wide limits because the range had huge potential, which of course could be inefficient, and so it is important, I think, to be overlaying the understanding what it is you're aiming for.
Yeah, it's and that's where, as we mentioned previously, which I didn't want to go too into, the capability analysis part is where you can make that picture, like we saw earlier on with the histogram referencing the 14-day target. But the limits are the limits. I mean, the limits are telling you if it's stable and predictable. That is, if you keep doing the same thing that you've been doing when you generated the initial data, then the process is going to keep giving you those results. It's like the definition of insanity to expect it to do something different without having to change. So if that's masking some other inefficiency, the message is still the same. You've got to have to reduce the variation.
Yeah. Thanks, Damion, and thanks, Stephen.
That's okay. So that nicely brings us on to just a summary then of today. So we said there's always going to be variation. It's natural. Therefore, you shouldn't be surprised when you see it. And using control charts to make sense of variation is it's the most valuable way of avoiding making poor decisions. As we saw in the exercise we did earlier on, where we may have gone off and started, blaming people or trying to problem solve when there wasn't anything there to go after. And control charts are great at telling us when to take action, which in themselves, if we go after them and find the root cause, they give us learning about things that are affecting our process that we might not have otherwise discovered. And this point, not having to respond to these false alarms anymore, just think how much time that could save, let alone the decisions that you may avoid making that could have had profound impacts on people and motivation and company culture. And I mean, we could have done a whole webinar on that, I think. And control charts are the most robust way to determine if a change really did make a difference. So for those of you that work in improvement, highly recommend using control charts in your projects. And I think that draws us to an end for today. But thank you for all the questions we've had in. Is there any more on the boards, Suzanne?
No, I think that's everything. Genuinely a big thank you to everyone for participating. We hope we've got you thinking. And if you have any other questions, do get in touch with us, either myself or Damion. Before we do close, just a quick reminder about a couple of things. If you've been on our webinars before, you'll remember that we've done a lot to transform all of the training that we've been doing into the virtual classroom. And if you enroll on any of our public green belt or black belt or master black belt courses, then as part of that learning experience, we provide you with an Apple iPad, so you can use that iPad as an additional piece of equipment, as an additional screen during your training, which really helps enhance the learning experience. And when the training's over, you can keep it. Finally, all do please look out for our Voice to Customer survey. You'll receive it shortly. We really value your feedback, and in particular, we really value all of your suggestions. If you have a look at our website for our webinar page, you'll see lots of great webinars coming up on different topics in January, and a lot of these are based on all of your feedback. So I hope you'll all find something there that whets your appetite. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. So on behalf of PMI, happy birthday again, Damion. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much.
And on behalf of myself, thanks again for joining us this week. And I hope you all have a really safe and relaxing weekend. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.